For 14 years, a landlocked territory in southern Africa existed in a strange political limbo. It had a government, an army, a capital city, courts, borders, and daily life that continued under its own institutions. But to most of the world, it was not a legitimate country. This was Rhodesia, the de facto successor to the British colony of Southern Rhodesia, which declared independence on its own in 1965. Its leaders claimed they were defending stability and self-government. Its critics saw a white minority government trying to block black majority rule during the wider decolonization of Africa. The result was an unrecognized state, international sanctions, guerrilla war, political isolation, and eventually a negotiated transition into the Republic of Zimbabwe in 1980. To understand Rhodesia, it helps to begin with geography and colonial history. Southern Rhodesia lay north of South Africa, east of Botswana, west of Mozambique, and south of Zambia. Its major cities included Salisbury, today known as Harare, and Bulawayo. The territory had been shaped by British imperial expansion and settler colonialism, with political power concentrated in the hands of a white minority of European descent. Unlike many colonies ruled directly from London, Southern Rhodesia had a significant level of internal self-government. That meant local white-dominated institutions managed many domestic affairs, while Britain still retained ultimate authority over issues such as constitutional status and independence. This arrangement created a major confrontation when the Age of Empire began rapidly ending across Africa. The late 1950s and early 1960s were years of dramatic change across the continent. Ghana had become independent in 1957, and many other African territories followed. The principle that colonial rule should end, and that African majorities should govern themselves, gained momentum internationally. In southern Rhodesia, however, many white settlers feared that rapid majority rule would endanger their political position, property, and way of life. These fears were intensified by regional developments, including the independence of neighboring northern Rhodesia as Zambia in 1964. Britain was increasingly unwilling to grant independence without credible movement toward majority rule. Rhodesia's white-led government wanted independence on different terms. The disagreement was not simply procedural, it was about who had the right to rule. On November 11, 1965, Prime Minister Ian Smith and his cabinet issued the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, commonly called UDI. The word unilateral mattered. Rhodesia was not granted independence by Britain, it claimed independence without British consent. Smith's government argued that it was preserving responsible government and resisting what it viewed as a reckless handover of power. Britain rejected the declaration as illegal. The United Nations Security Council soon passed Resolution 216, calling on states not to recognize or assist Rhodesia. In practical terms, Rhodesia now controlled itself internally, but lacked de jure international recognition. It was a state in operation, but not in law according to the international community. This contradiction defined the country's entire existence. At first, Rhodesia still presented itself as loyal to the British Crown, hoping for recognition as an autonomous realm within the Commonwealth. That hope faded. In 1970, Rhodesia reconstituted itself as a republic, formally cutting the remaining symbolic tie to the monarchy. Its political system still borrowed heavily from the Westminster model. There was a prime minister as head of government, a ceremonial president as head of state, and parliamentary institutions modeled on British practice. But the central issue was the franchise. Political representation was structured in a way that heavily favored the white minority, while black Rhodesians, despite being the overwhelming majority of the population, had very limited power. The state's constitutional form looked familiar, its political reality was deeply unequal. Before 1970, Rhodesia had a unicameral legislative assembly dominated by white representatives, with a small number of seats reserved for black representatives. After the Republic was declared, this was replaced by a bicameral parliament with a House of Assembly and a Senate. These institutions gave Rhodesia the appearance of a conventional parliamentary state, but the racial franchise remained its defining feature. Voting rights and representation were not based on universal adult suffrage. Instead, political participation was shaped by qualifications and structures that preserved white minority control. For supporters of the government, this was framed as gradualism and protection from instability. For African nationalists and most of the international community, it was a denial of basic democratic equality. The dispute did not remain only diplomatic. After UDI, two major African nationalist movements intensified their struggle against the Rhodesian government, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, and the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU. Both sought an end to minority rule, but they had different leaderships, networks, and political identities. Their armed wings became central to what is often called the Rhodesian Bush War, or Zimbabwe's Liberation War. This was not a conventional war between two equal armies. It involved guerrilla operations, cross-border support, rural mobilization, counterinsurgency, intelligence networks, and pressure on civilian communities. As the conflict grew, Rhodesia's internal security problem became inseparable from regional politics and Cold War-era alliances. Rhodesia's isolation also took an economic form. The United Nations imposed an extensive trade embargo intended to pressure the government into accepting majority rule. Sanctions were designed to deny Rhodesia the normal benefits of international commerce, finance, and diplomatic legitimacy. In practice, sanctions were difficult to enforce perfectly, and Rhodesia developed ways to evade them through sympathetic networks, regional connections, and domestic adaptation. But the pressure still mattered. It raised costs, limited options, and reinforced the state's pariah status. Rhodesia's closest regional comparison was South Africa, another white minority-ruled state, though South Africa had wider international recognition and greater economic power. For Rhodesia, surviving without recognition required constant improvisation. By the late 1970s, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult for Rhodesia's government. The war was draining resources and confidence. International pressure remained intense. Neighboring Mozambique, formerly a Portuguese colony, became independent in 1975, changing the regional environment and increasing the strategic pressure on Rhodesia's eastern border. The idea that minority rule could continue indefinitely became less plausible. Ian Smith eventually conceded the principle of majority rule in 1978. But the question was how that transition would happen, and whether it would be accepted by the guerrilla movements and the wider world. A settlement that excluded the main nationalist forces was unlikely to end the war or win recognition. Rhodesia's government pursued what became known as an internal settlement. This arrangement created a multiracial provisional government and brought the moderate Bishop Abel Muzorewa into a leading role. In 1979, the country briefly became known as Zimbabwe Rhodesia. Elections were held, and Muzorewa became prime minister, succeeding Ian Smith. To supporters, this showed that Rhodesia had moved beyond exclusive white rule. To critics, it was not enough, because the settlement did not fully include ZANU and ZAPU, the armed nationalist movements still fighting the war. International recognition did not follow. The conflict continued. The internal settlement revealed a key reality: a transition needed domestic participation, but also international legitimacy and acceptance by the principal armed actors. The decisive breakthrough came with the Lancaster House Agreement in 1979, negotiated in London. Under this arrangement, Zimbabwe Rhodesia briefly reverted to British colonial status so that new elections could be held under British supervision. This step may sound unusual, but it was central to creating a legal bridge from the disputed UDI era to internationally recognized independence. It allowed Britain to oversee a transition that the international community could accept, while giving the nationalist movements a route into elections rather than continued war. The agreement did not erase the violence or distrust of the previous years, but it established the framework for ending Rhodesia's unrecognized status and resolving the constitutional crisis that had begun in 1965. In 1980, general elections were held under universal suffrage, and ZANU won. The territory then became the internationally recognized Republic of Zimbabwe. Rhodesia's 14-year existence had ended, but its legacy remained deeply important. It was a case study in the collision between settler minority rule and African decolonization, between claims of self-government and demands for democratic majority rule, and between de facto control and international legal recognition. Its history also shows that states are not defined only by flags, armies, or parliaments. Recognition, legitimacy, and consent matter. Rhodesia functioned as a state for years, yet its refusal to accept majority rule left it isolated, contested, and ultimately transformed into something new. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.